By most metrics I could find online, Firefly is the most popular Star Rail character. Her subreddit has the most members, and a recent Japanese popularity poll also put her at number 1, where it wasn't even close. Of course, this is largely a result of her characterization throughout Penacony's story, but Hoyoverse knew they had to capitalize on the hype for this character that had been building up for months by giving her a strong kit that's easy to use. Unfortunately, this went at odds with their decision to make her a break DPS. Because they function so differently compared to the other more conventional DPS characters, the designers needed to be extra careful in making sure the inherent drawbacks of break didn't have strong negative effects on our user experience. Over time, the developers have evidently gotten better at ensuring characters are no longer held back by their unique aspects, but I have to admit that Firefly demonstrates the opposite extreme. They compensated so hard for her weaknesses to the point where they basically became new strengths for her. Overall, I'd say her gameplay was designed really well and they succeeded in making her super fun to play, but it's also quite apparent that her kit is rather overloaded. Like for every detail that I find to be really smart, there's another that she'd be completely fine without. Let's break down exactly how the developers went about crafting what could very well continue to be the strongest, most synergistic character design ever created in Honkai Star Rail. Firefly's entire gameplay revolves around doing break and super break damage, which is entirely enabled by her ultimate's complete combustion state, by giving her speed, stronger attacks, increased weakness break efficiency, and a bit of extra break damage received by enemies. But instead of her ultimate reliance being a hard liability like it is with some characters, Firefly just shrugs that condition off by only needing 2 skill usages to recharge her ult, each of which also action advances her by 25%. Even if you mess up, don't have skill points, and need to basic attack once, that's still faster than pretty much every other character. The second skill doesn't even really register as you needing to spend a turn to charge because her ultimate advances her next action by 100% anyway. So realistically, she only has 1 complete turn of downtime because by turn 2 she's back at full strength again. And starting battle with half energy cuts out that first turn, so you essentially start combat with your ult. Plus, you never have to worry about getting kills or taking hits to charge that last bit of energy. Having an action advance on her ult to begin with makes sense because her combustion state lasts until a countdown with 70 fixed speed hits the action order, so having her act at the start of this counter makes the number of enhanced attacks she gets consistent. They could have just made her ult give her a set number of enhanced attacks, but the way they ended up doing it makes it so that she scales harder with speed by being able to get more total actions during her ult without the usual drawback of needing to refresh it sooner. And because the list of actions resets after finishing a wave, clearing one effectively refreshes the combustion state's entire cooldown for free, so that's 2 more features to make her feel less ultimate reliant. The only downside to this system is that you can potentially get less total enhanced attacks from being slowed or stunned, but they already planned ahead for that too. Getting to max energy has an extra little feature, being that it removes all debuffs. At first, I thought this was just to prevent her from potentially dying to a DOT right after using her ult, since her skill can potentially leave her at 1 HP. But if that were the case, they could have made it work on DOTs only, like with Eidolons. The fact that it's universal means she is able to freely remove slows and more, and combined with her talent's effect resistance, it's clear the intention is to not let her enhanced state be interrupted. This is a straightforward evolution in design from Jingyuan, whose Lightning Lord damage gets fully halted from an untimely stun and has no built-in ways to avoid that happening. However, Firefly's complete combustion state already lasts fairly long and is easy to recharge, meaning that relying on a healer to cleanse any potential debuffs isn't really that bad. So even though it's not the most consistent, having only 30% effect resistance at level 10, I still find it quite interesting they deemed it necessary to add in the first place. The energy gained from her unenhanced skill actually also scales with its level, going from 50% up to 60% max energy at level 10. At first I didn't really understand what the point was to making it slightly more than half, but then I realized when maxed out, it's the perfect amount to where you can take 1 hit from the stupid TV enemy and not have to deal with any consequences. Her having the highest energy cost in the game at 240, tied with Yunli who doesn't really count because her ult has 2 charges, was a pretty smart choice. Her combustion state puts a lock icon on her energy gauge to signify she can't ult again, but she can still get energy, just not from her abilities because they're hard-coded to grant 0. So even though it's possible to shorten her ult's brief downtime, the energy cost makes it much less feasible. However, if she is able to get full energy somehow, she can immediately re-enter the complete combustion state. I don't think we're gonna get a support capable of doing that for the next few years at least, But there is a certain game mode that coincidentally dropped on the same update as Firefly, where this happens on every boss fight. This is simply one of many reasons why Divergent Universe is actually just Firefly's playground. Firefly always starting battle with 50% energy initially seems geared just for overworld gameplay since endgame content always starts you at half anyway, but it allows her to always have ult turn 1 in simulated universe game modes, which is really nice, but is also something no other character even comes close to having. Characters being able to accelerate their own kits is nothing new, but every character except Firefly requires using their technique for it. And I almost forgot to mention Firefly's enhanced basic attack. It's usually not that interesting because her enhanced skill is leagues better of course, but she is the only character to have access to both instead of just one. The downside is that her stronger ability does require skill points, but she also gains the freedom to generate skill points when she doesn't need the power of her skill. It's honestly really frustrating to use a limited turn of enhanced ability just to take out one weak enemy, so Firefly having this flexibility in exchange for something almost all DPS units have to deal with anyway is a pretty worth trade-off in my opinion. Moving on to her break damage, it's also min-maxed to the absolute limit. Break is pretty interesting because it doesn't use the same stats as normal damage. From the attacker, it scales based on just their level and their break effect, which makes stats like attack and damage percent not do much. So that's why Firefly's enhanced skill additionally scales with her break effect, and why her final ascension trace increases her break effect based on her attack. This way, the attacks she gets from things like light cones and relics don't feel completely wasted. Technically, she has one of the highest scaling blast attacks in the game, but that doesn't exactly make it strong because her break build won't have crit or fire damage percent to multiply it. That much is apparent when fighting enemies with locked toughness bars. However, it can be okay enough in situations where enemies are left with a really small amount of health. The break effect is obviously much more useful for her super break, which she is able to proc by herself with her 4th ascension trace. She doesn't get the full 50% unless she has 360 break effect, but given how many teammates and relic sets can give break, it's a high yet feasible threshold to reach. And since Super Break adds toughness reduction to its damage formula, Firefly's enhanced weakness break efficiency combined with her enhanced skills already higher than usual base toughness damage gives her a huge damage boost on top of it, allowing her to break enemies much faster. But of course you can't deal break damage without dealing toughness damage, and Firefly happens to have the most broken iteration of Toughness Bypass out of any character ever. Every single enhanced skill applies fire weakness against the main target for 2 of their turns. This is insane utility to have on a non-support character, because it's not like you have to waste skill points to apply it since you're already going to be using her skill for damage anyway. Given the frequency of its application and its duration, it means you don't have to put much of any effort into thinking about how you're using it either. Ignoring weakness type is one thing, but implanting fire weakness is so much stronger. It not only allows Firefly to maintain type advantage even when she's not using her enhanced skill, but it also allows any fire type ally to deal toughness damage as well. And if that weren't enough, she still ignores weakness type anyway in her enhanced state, which of course only ends up affecting the adjacent targets on her skill and at a reduced 55% effectiveness, but it still ends up being extremely useful against smaller side enemies. But there's still more, as her technique applies fire weakness to all enemies at the start of each wave, so she automatically has full weakness break efficiency against any enemy for 2 turns as well. The huge disadvantage of having your break DPS not match the weakness type of the enemies has and will continue to be a huge detriment to running such characters, but Firefly manages to turn the situation on its head by being at close to max efficiency against any enemy regardless of type. With weakness breaking out of the picture, all that's left is enemy type resistance. Since resistance can go into the negatives, Firefly still does more damage against enemies that originally have fire weakness even with resistance penetration, but her ability to get the full damage vulnerability and action delay on enemies from breaking no matter what is undoubtedly one of the biggest reasons for her status as a top tier. And lastly, we have the least practical aspect of Firefly's kit, her health manipulation. Using her skill consumes 40% of her max HP, yet unlike Blade, she doesn't get any net benefits from taking damage. Similar to Jingliu and Jade's health consumption mechanics, this feels more like a thematic addition rather than something added for the sake of gameplay. Because if the point was to add a factor of risk to balance out how powerful her skill's energy recharges, they again overcompensated heavily. As soon as Firefly hits 20% HP from using her second skill, she can just use her ultimate to advance her next action and use either of her attacks to heal. Her enhanced state also gives the final condition for her talent, giving her max damage reduction for the entire duration and the additional 30% effect resistance. I get that destruction characters are slightly more likely to get targeted than other characters, but it's kind of crazy that her defensive utility is on par with Yunli, who is quite literally encouraged to tank as many hits as possible, especially when breaking also delays enemies from attacking in the first place. Again, perhaps for thematic reasons, Firefly has close to the lowest HP in the game, but it's balanced out with the highest base defense by far. Even though I think this all contributes to Firefly's kit being overloaded, I can't really fault the designers for this because it does seem like it was implemented to be symbolic of the character. And even though it ends up making her have generally better survivability than most other characters, you're still encouraged to bring a healer for her much frailer teammates. I've previously discussed the idea of having an HP consumption team archetype, but I don't think Firefly would end up having a place there because she's so break-centric. However, we can see that these mechanics lead to one new synergy with Lingsha, who gets a free follow-up attack/heal when enemies are at 60% HP or less, conveniently the same percentage as where Firefly lands after using her first skill to charge her ult. Lingsha has this 6th Ascension trace as a way to emergency save low health allies, but it also is an attack that could potentially never trigger if your team stays completely healthy, so Firefly's HP consumption genuinely optimizes Lingsha's damage despite it not doing anything meaningful for herself. Well, that's all for Firefly's kit, but her influence extends even beyond that to her equipment. In the same update that she debuted in, we got both of her best in slot relic sets. The Iron Cavalry set gives her break effect of course, but the 4-piece set bonus gives defense ignore on break and super break, which really helps as it's a rare alternate stat that also contributes to break damage. However, it is the only Cavern Relic set so far to have a stat threshold, which Firefly obviously surpasses much more easily than other characters thanks to her attack to break effect conversion. And then it gets even more shameless when we get to the planar relics, which are known to have stricter conditions. The Forge set gives speed, which is always appreciated, but it also gives a free 40% break effect for hitting an enemy that has a fire weakness. So not only does she always have access to this buff, but she enables any break support to reap the benefits as well. Aside from locked toughness bars, which I'd say is more of a break team problem rather than a Firefly problem, she really only has 2 significant drawbacks built into her design. 1, she's quite skill point reliant, and 2, she doesn't do as well against a lineup of 5 enemies. I suppose her team comps are also a bit more rigid because of her unique stat demands, but having a free unit and a 4-star on your second best team makes it not that bad relatively speaking. For skill points, I honestly never really find myself running into issues at E0, so this drawback honestly doesn't feel that bad to just play around. However, if you wanted a more expensive shortcut, Firefly's first Eidolon gives her more of the coveted defense ignore, while also making her enhanced skill never consume skill points. And for her weakness against larger volumes of enemies, you have her second Eidolon, which gives her an extra turn upon defeating an enemy. It can't be cycled repeatedly, but even still, if you're fighting a lot of enemies, they tend to be the weaker ones, and with this E2 she just has easy access to doubling her turns, which at this point already won't need any skill points at all. I usually don't care for Eidolons when it comes to limited 5-stars, but those first 2 are so good that I can completely understand why someone would prefer having those over a different character. The rest of her Eidolons enhance what she's already good at, which isn't a bad thing, but they don't have nearly as much impact as those initial ones. In summary, Firefly is an ultimate reliant character that has long uptime, free refreshes, the fastest recharge in the game, and a built-in cleanse with effect resistance. She's also a break DPS that can implant her own weakness type to universally get full efficiency on her higher than average toughness damage. She still has weakness type ignore anyway. She converts her attack, which would normally be useless, into break effect, while also having break effect scaling on her upfront damage, and she generates her own super break. And then she also has action advance, damage reduction, and free speed on top of that. So yeah, saying Hoyoverse succeeded in delivering on Firefly's kit is kind of an understatement. I feel like even if you removed some of her features, she'd still be one of the best characters in the game. She puts the other break DPS characters in a weird spot because everything in her kit makes her both extremely powerful and versatile. So even though they do have some advantages over her, they are much less pronounced than they probably should be. I feel like it would be pretty difficult to make content she doesn't work well in, because specific things like disabling toughness reduction for enemies or locking ultimates hurts a lot of characters, not just her. The thing about Firefly though is that because she has it so good right now with the best possible partners already available for her, she doesn't have as much room to get buffed in the future. She pretty much already has everything she needs in her own kit, so her best teammates are the ones that give her the stats she wants. This also means the unique mechanics future allies can provide likely won't be as useful for her. As a straightforward example, a character like Acheron will inevitably become stronger when more debuffers with frequent application are released because she'll be able to ult more often. Even with other break characters there's room for growth, like Rappa would hugely benefit from a break support with flat energy recharge, but that'd be significantly worse with Firefly. While Firefly has certainly set a high standard for break units, and that's never going to change, I do think the others can further build upon their unique strengths down the line, whereas she can't. And maybe with time, Firefly probably won't fall off completely, but I'd be very surprised if she stays at the top forever, just due to the nature of power creep and the meta which could change at any time. With Break being the archetype which diverges the most from standard gameplay, I'm really interested to see what other mechanics Star Rail can continue to build teams around, but I do hope they continue to be careful with how weaknesses are handled. It admittedly is a very fine line because when they feel bad, they feel really bad. But all we can do now is wait and see if Firefly is the exception, or if her design direction will eventually become the new normal. I hope you found this video to be interesting or insightful. Subscribe for more Honkai Star Rail discussion videos, and as always, thanks for watching.